Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Um, I hope that you are all enjoying this lovely long weekend. I certainly am. James, what have you been up to?
I have been trying to spend every moment in the sun.
Mm.
Yeah, and I'm probably going to disappear on Monday, isn't it? But
Gonna say it feels very selfish of me to have you down here then, because there is comparatively little sun in indoors for the webinar. So we'll try not to keep everyone away from the good weather wherever they are. Um, So, yes. So for those of you who haven't come to one of these webinars before, my name is Matt. I look after the research side of things here at Uni Admissions. So my job is to make sure that all of the things that we're going to talk about today, that we're able to back those up with good quality evidence, that they have, there's real proof that they work, that they help students, that they improve outcomes. And then I present these webinars and convey that information to you. And I'm joined by my colleague, James. James, who are you?
yes, a very good question. Nice to meet you, everybody. I see some familiar faces, well, names, shall I say. Lovely to see you back. My name's James. I work with our students to help them sort of set a clear plan of action for their applications, really, and sort of help guide them through often, quite a daunting process. And I'm very pleased to be joining you again, Matt. 2 weeks in a row. Well, no, 2 open days in a row, should I say?
Yes. I must say I'm enjoying the spare Saturdays, but I will also be more than happy to go back to the more frequent format when we do that. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about the different criteria there are for that are used by the universities to assess your application, kind of breaking down the different parts, talking about the different weightings they have, really giving you a sense of how things are looked at from the other side. And next week we're going to be talking about the UCAS form. That's the UCAS form as distinct from the personal statement, really helping work through the boring part almost. It's a bit that a lot of students forget and have to rush at the end. And I think it's really helpful for giving proper context to your application, which is kind of what we're going for this week as well. Really giving you a sense of what it is that the person making that decision is going to be looking at when you applied and when they're working out what they want to do with you. So let's get going. Oh, and we're starting immediately with the pie chart. I'd forgotten that was going to happen. Oh, it's a trick. James, are you ready, or are you not warmed up yet?
I would like to think I've never not been ready for a pie chart. So yeah, many of you guys have seen our pie chart before. And the idea is, it's obviously, we all know it's very, very competitive applying to Oxford and Cambridge. But I think what fewer people tend to really understand is actually how you're going to be assessed when you apply for these universities. So we'll talk about it in more detail today, of course, but the pie chart is a really good kind of visual representation of how this works. It varies slightly from subject to subject, but as a really good rule of thumb, it's essentially 25% based on your GCSE results, 15% based on your A-level predictions, around 30% based on the admissions test that the vast majority of subjects require, about 25% based on your interview, and then that final 10% is your personal statement, which, as I think we're going to go on to in a little while, is quite a shock to people. I think most people think the personal statement is going to be the yellow or the green category, but no, it's not. So yeah, there we go. I mean, in terms of how you approach your application, it's really good to know what to prioritize, what you do and don't have control over. And that's what the pie chart represents.
Thanks, James. Yes, we'll be sort of going through each of these portions through the rest of the presentation, but if there's one thing to kind of stick in your mind, particularly at this early stage in the application process, this is the thing I would pick. Try and remember, do your best to remember this, all the slices. Now, the first of these slices we've talked about is the GCSE scores and the A-level predictions. Now, the thing to understand here is that the weight given to GCSEs and A-levels has changed a fair bit over the last few years. You may remember there was some disruption to education a couple of years ago. Can't remember why, very mysterious. But one of the knock-on effects of that was that the grading of GCSE and A-level exams became, I don't want to say more generous because I don't want to undermine the achievements of those students, but the grades became less informative from an admissions tutor perspective because more students were getting higher grades, and that made it hard to tell which of those students were the best within that group of high-scoring students. If you can imagine that if everyone got an A, it would be very difficult to tell which was the best A student within the scope of those A's. And although it wasn't everyone getting an A, certainly a much larger share of students were getting A's than had been previously. And that makes the work of admissions tutors much more difficult. Now, that phenomenon is on its way back down. The Joint Office for Qualifications and Ofqual have said that they are expecting that results will be back down to their pre-pandemic levels this year. And so we have sort of adjusted up the weight of GCSEs and A-levels in our pie chart compared with last year when they were a fair bit lower. And that's because of these changes in exam performance. It's a little bit technical, so don't worry too much if this doesn't make perfect sense to you. It's just to say that your GCSEs and your A-level predictions, they're still pretty important. They're still not the most important part of the application, but they do sort of matter a bit more than they would have done last year. So that's that. Now, thinking about Oxford or Cambridge. Now, neither of them is easier to get into. Oxford interview fewer applicants than Cambridge, so if you are super confident in your test scores, you might be tempted to go for Oxford rather than Cambridge, because if you're confident you'll get to the interview, you're competing with fewer people at that stage at Oxford than you are at Cambridge. But competition per place is still very similar between the two universities. Where there are gaps, those gaps tend to be driven by a few courses at Oxford that are really disproportionately popular. I'm thinking of PPE and E&M particularly, and of course computer science on the Cambridge side. But broadly speaking, it isn't as though you might think, oh, I won't get into Oxford, we'll get into Cambridge. Cambridge is the easy one. It's the good one as well. Oxford's rubbish. They didn't want me. Not insecure about that at all. In terms of the grades you're going to need to get, most of the art subjects at Oxford ask for 3 A's. Most of the STEM subjects ask for A star and 2 A's, and a few subjects, it's the either 3 or 4 math subjects plus one of the engineering plus engineering and chemistry. They ask you to get A star, A. So that's particularly difficult at Oxford. Cambridge, meanwhile, it's still an A star and 2 A's, or 2 A stars and an A for almost everything. The other thing to be aware of here, and this is basically bad news. Both Oxford and Cambridge will each year make more offers than they have places. This means that if you have been offered, let's say, AAA by Oxford, and you get AAB, even if you get A star AB, it may well be the case that you are not going to be able to negotiate with them to get in if you don't quite make your offer, because they will have put out, let's say, 12 offers for every 10 places, and they've done that on the basis that they know from a kind of statistical standpoint that only 10 of those 12 people are going to get the grades. Unfortunately, if you are one of those people who misses out because of your grades, it is really difficult to get them to change their minds about this. We saw sort of evidence of this a couple of years ago in the first year of the teacher assessed grades, where both Oxford and Cambridge ended up with something like 300 or 400 more students than they had been expecting, because they decided to let everyone in, whether they'd met their offer conditions or not. And that created all sorts of problems for both universities. They literally didn't have space for people. I think there was a few people who ended up having their student accommodation be an Airbnb for the first year. And that is because of this setup where they will make more offers than they have places. So that's something to be aware of. You really need to make sure that you do get those grades, whether that's in A-levels or Scottish Highers or Irish Leaving Cert or one of the various baccalaureates around. Make sure you do hit those scores, because they really do matter. So, having taken that into account, how should you go about choosing between subjects? Quite a few of the degrees that you can study at Oxford and Cambridge will be titles that you won't have studied at school. You can't study PPE at school. You can study philosophy, you can study politics, you can study economics, but you can't study them all at once. You can study chemistry, but not biochemistry. There are a lot of different subjects, so it's worth really exploring what it is that you want to go for, rather than necessarily going straight for the subject that you were best at school. Double checking there isn't something that is going to really work for you, that you're going to be really suitable for, that is particular to that degree level of study. If you're thinking about taking a gap year, generally speaking, this doesn't go well if you're applying for a STEM subject. And this basically boils down to people forgetting how to do maths during their year off. Maybe you won't have that problem, but certainly if I stop doing maths for more than a couple of weeks, I do forget how. It may not be the case for you. Perhaps you do, difficult maths papers for fun at the weekends. But the experience we've had and the advice that the universities give is that it is harder to come back after a gap year in a STEM subject than it is in other areas. And as I've mentioned there, the number of people applying and the competition does vary quite a lot between subjects. So it's worth taking that into account when you're picking what subject you're going to go for. If you're not fussed about the difference between chemistry and biochemistry, it's worth knowing that your odds when it comes to applying for chemistry are a fair bit better than for biochemistry. I mentioned a few slides back some of the really popular subjects. One of the reasons that so few people get into Oxford and Cambridge is there are these 3 unbelievably competitive subjects. So that's 8 people applying for every place at Oxford for PPE. I think 13 for every place to study E&M, and 12? Yeah, about 12 applying for every place to study computer science. Like I said, it's difficult for me to do maths if I haven't been practicing. Now, these are really prestigious, really attractive subjects that a lot of people apply for. But if you are applying for PPE, bear these numbers in mind. It is a really competitive, difficult to get into subject. And so it's worth being realistic about that and looking, if you would be perfectly happy studying history instead, it may be that you've got a better shot there. But, we're not in the business of dissuading you from studying the subject of your dreams. We're in the business of, getting you the place to study the subject of your dreams. We talked a little bit about the pie chart earlier. This is one of the sources for the pie chart. This is an extract from the Oxford PPE Admissions Manual. And what this shows you is how the universities look at these things when weighting your application. And what you'll see here is that the admissions test is the most important thing above even the GCSEs, your predicted performance, above your school reference, above what you've done in your AS if you did AS levels, and that the personal statement is right down there at the bottom. I bring this back here because it's something that we have shown in our pie chart, but I think it's helpful to see it right from the horse's mouth, so to speak. Now, James, can you remind me a few of the reasons that the admissions test is given so much weight by the universities?
I can indeed. Yeah. I mean, when you think about it, generally speaking, most students are applying with very similar profiles in terms of their GCSE grades, in terms of their predicted A-levels. generally speaking, most people are putting the same kinds of things on their personal statement. So for the eyes of the universities, it's quite difficult to decide between all of these, strong students. Equally, lots of students are doing many different sort of curriculums. It might be the A-levels, it might be the IB, you might be in India doing the CBSE, you might be doing Singaporean A-levels, the whole host of different kind of curriculums that you could be studying. So the admissions tests really are a way for the universities to compare students against each other. Most of these tests, everybody will sit on the same day at the same time. So it really is that opportunity for the universities to differentiate between, all of these strong students on paper. And that's why it's so important. And I think we had a specific open day a while ago where we really worked through a lot of the test data. And I think we might look at some in a moment, actually. But there is such a clear correlation between score and offer. So yeah, admissions tests are really, really important.
Yeah, that's absolutely spot on, James. Like you say, it's the only thing that every person applying will have done. They won't all have read the same books. They won't all have sat the same exams. They won't all have studied the same subjects, but they will all have done this same test. And so it's the only thing where you can make an entirely fair comparison, which is what makes it so important and so why it's given so much weight in the decision. Now, this may all sound a little bit scary, but there are some good things to say here. We talked about your GCSE grades only representing around a quarter of your chances. Your A-level predictions, another few percent, again, maybe 15. You take all of that into account, and if you're planning to apply in what is it, just about 6 months' time, you still have control over 3/4 of your chance of getting in, 75%. The only thing that you've locked in so far is that GCSE profile. Everything else you still have loads of scope to improve upon. An admissions test is going to be, as we just saw, given more weight than your GCSEs. So if you feel that your GCSEs didn't show you in your best light, you can do better. You have the chance to do something that matters more than that whole GCSE performance in 6 months' time, and you can be really well prepared for that. This is where we talk about, not spending too much time on the personal statement. Don't spend hours and weeks shuffling the commas around or deciding whether or not to use an adverb or an adjective in a particular sentence. Focus your energy on the admissions tests, on beginning your interview preparation nice and early, really focusing on the things that matter, because you don't want to be in a position where you're working loads harder than other applicants, but you can definitely work much more smartly. Ugh, that was a dreadful phrase. Yeah. See, that's the kind of thing you want to take out of the personal statement, though. Oh, and that's what I said. Literally again on another slide. It is worth bearing in mind here, particularly that the personal statement is given less weight than the school reference. Figure out who at school is going to write your UCAS reference for you. Speak to them. Well, not now because it's the weekend, and not next week because it's the school holidays, but the following week. Speak to whichever teacher it is that you want to do that reference and start that conversation now. Say, I would like to do this. I'm planning to apply to this university for this subject. Really help support that teacher in getting you a good reference, something that will actually reflect what you're interested in, that will tick the right boxes for the admissions tutor. And most of all, teachers are busy. It is a job that I have not chosen to do because it looks far too much like hard work, and I'm very lazy. If you give them loads of time and notice to do something, they will do a good job. If you've asked your teacher a week before the deadline, they might do a bad job. They won't have time. Be considerate of other people's time and plan accordingly. If you start working on it now, then you're much more likely to get a good result than you are panicking about it in the 3rd week of September. We've got a couple of slides. I'm going to skip these personal statement slides if that's okay, because we're going to be coming back to personal statements in a bit more detail next month. And and just round off on what we were saying about admissions tests. So James mentioned earlier about the strong correlation that we see between test score and outcomes. And what we have here is this really helpful little distributional graph showing the relationship between performance in the admissions test and whether or not you get in. So what we've got here is a really nice traditional looking bell curve. It's a bounded bell curve because you can't get more than 100% on the test, but it is relatively straightforward. It's very difficult to get 0% on the test because these are multiple choice tests, and it's really hard to do really badly on a multiple choice test. It's really hard to do really well, but you will, generally speaking, score, well, the formula is PN, what is it? PN over N. I'll write it down one day. We'll do that in the admissions test one. But there is kind of a guaranteed baseline score in multiple choice tests. So taking that into account, what we see is this lovely smooth bell curve. But what we also see are these quite nice bell curve shapes sort of nested within it. So we see that the distribution of people being shortlisted, which in this context means being invited for interview, has a similar shape to it, as does the distribution of offers. And what this shows us is if you're scoring below, let's say 50% on this particular test, there's a very small chance that you might get an interview. Very small numbers of people are getting interviews at this point. Maybe one in, what have we got? We're close to 200 people in this column. And that looks to me like maybe 10 are getting an interview. So maybe a 5% chance of getting an interview there. And those odds aren't really improving until you get above this 65% mark. All of a sudden, above 65, you go from being a really quite small chance of getting that interview, this white area. All of a sudden, you're seeing that 50% of students are getting interviews, compared with not even a third in the previous section of the graph. You also see that offers are starting to happen. There are a very small number of people getting offers down here, maybe 2 or 3. And these will probably be students who had some kind of mitigating circumstance. You know, maybe their hamster died the night before the exam, or something more serious. Whereas once we get here into the high scores, you can see that there are many, many more offers. As we get into the top few percent of the distribution, you'll notice that everyone is getting an interview, apart from these people who I guess were really annoying. Maybe they had really bad personal statements. And you see that at a certain point, you get to a stage where your odds of getting an offer are close to 50%, more than 50%, and when almost everyone is getting an offer in that very top portion. And so whoever it was there who didn't get an offer but did score one of the top scores, they must have been really annoying. Really unpleasant to interview. But what you see here is there's this really strong correlation between the performance in the admissions tests and the actual outcome. This graph doesn't incorporate any information from GCSEs, from A-levels, from the personal statement. None of that information is in here. In fact, the information about how well they did in the interview isn't in here. All this shows us is the relationship between the test score and the outcome. And what we see is the test score is really predictive. And that's why we put so much emphasis on it when talking to students about how to plan their application. So, to sort of round this off, as we saw there, moving only a few points in these admissions tests from something like the 59th to the 66th percentile, that can double your chances of being interviewed. These admissions tests, they're the only like-for-like comparison that the universities have this year, or indeed any year, and they matter more than your personal statement. And that's kind of it for today, I think. But there is more to the services we offer as a prep school than just these slides. There's loads more, and James is going to tell you about it in the next few slides. I hope that you've revised these, James, because they've changed. As these these are the new slides for 2023. So any loyal viewers who've come in previous weeks, this will be exciting for us all because we can see how well James deals with the new slides that he might not be ready for.
You know, keeping me on my toes for sure. Okay, well, I shall give it a shot. Well, yeah, many of you, I'm sure, know that we're actually a preparation school for Oxford, Cambridge, and also medicine. So this is what we do. And we have programs of support to help students prepare effectively. As you've seen, you know, there's a lot of moving parts in this application, and a lot of the outcome of this application is going to be determined by, you know, what a student does now until, you know, it finishes. And so the idea of a program really is just to support students with a really clear structure, the right input, so that they can improve and give themselves the best chance of attaining an offer. So I'm just going to run you through a kind of overview of what a program tends to consist of. Obviously, if you'd like to find out more, please give us a call. But first of all, most students with us will have one-to-one tuition. So working with a tutor who's been through this experience successfully themselves, so they're able to kind of give you some really relevant guidance, working towards the admissions tests, interviews, and so on and so forth. I think actually for admissions tests, I don't go on about this for too long, but it's actually really, really important, I think, to get tuition, because what invariably happens when you prepare for a test is that your score will improve, of course. You know, everybody can improve a score with practice, but over time you'll start to plateau in your score. And generally speaking, that isn't down to content knowledge. The reason that you plateau is actually more about how you're approaching the test. And generally that's where, you know, working with a tutor makes a big difference. It's pushing you past your plateau to try and get you into one of the sort of, you know, top deciles of the test. So all of our students work with a tutor. Then I'm going to sneakily wait until the next slide comes on. Okay, materials. So we have written quite a large number of books, you know, on the application. So for the admissions test, the interviews, and so on. And we've created, you know, really, really large number of materials. So for the test preparation, for the interview preparation, and personal statements as well. So our students work through quite a structured curriculum of materials so that they're preparing effectively, as well as the materials.
Yeah, I'm glad we didn't try and remember how many books this week, because it remains a confusing question. It's at least 100. We're not totally sure how many books at this point, which is a nice problem to have.
Yeah, impressive nonetheless, I would say. All of our students will also be attending intensive courses. So these are sort of courses that take place, you know, before the deadlines of the application. They're sort of consolidatory sessions to make sure students are, you know, really where they need to be. So for example, in our interview weekends, our students have 4 mock interviews with different tutors and individual feedbacks. It's that final springboard into the different elements of an application. Beyond the intensive courses, our students also attend weekly enrichment sessions. So depending on your subject, our students will join a stream relevant to that subject. So medicine, you know, economics, law, whatever it may be. And this is all about broadening a student's understanding of key topics within that subject, building their awareness. And actually, these are interactive sessions. So it's really about practicing and developing your ability to discuss areas of interest and discuss what you know about your subject, because that's a large part of how you're going to be assessed in your interview. So what you don't want to do, as many students will do, is lots and lots and lots of reading, but never actually practice, you know, verbalizing what they've read and what they think about it. And ultimately, the interview is a communicative assessment. So you have to start as kind of, you mean to go on. You've got to practice talking about things, and the enrichment sessions are a great opportunity to do that. We also have Aha, this is like the Where's Wally slide. I found it. Okay. So, of course, getting a great admissions test score, getting, being really well prepared for your interview, that's obviously important. But actually, I think a lot of what stresses a student out, shall I say, a lot of the kind of pressure around applying all of these sort of external questions like, which college should I apply to? Which subject should I apply to? If I want to study law, should I apply to Oxford or Cambridge? There's a lot of questions and what you could say is strategy around those decisions within an application. And so a student on our program, we're supporting them for everything, both the academic side of things, shall we say, but also the guidance side of things. So our students work with a form mentor and they're part of a small form group. And that's all about kind of keeping you on track, helping you with these sort of more strategic decisions within an application. And then finally, let's see, we also have a portal. So we've put an enormous amount of effort and time into creating an online portal that our students use. Our students have their own personalized portal and it houses everything related to their application. So it's all in one place. Their reading list, all of the materials, all the test practice, submitting personal statements and written work, it all comes together under the portal, which is the hub of the program. And it's a great tracking tool as well for yourselves and your tutor, so they can really see how you're developing in your application. And I believe that may be the slides.
Well done, James. Thrown into the deep end, and you managed to figure out what horrible slides I'd made for you. The good news is all of this does seem to work. We have a really enviable set of results that we're really proud of. We had our 500th all-time offer early this year, and we're hoping to push that to 600-700 in the coming months. It also compares really well with some of the more expensive and more exclusive schools in the country. Sorry, the graph isn't prettier, but I'm still working on this one. And that's what we're particularly proud of too. So what we'll do now is we will take some questions. If you drop your questions into the Q&A section, we will try to answer them. We may not succeed. The main reason we tend not to succeed is I'll do my very best to answer all of your questions, so will James, but sometimes the queries that parents and students come to us with are very particular to their circumstances. Or if they're not particular to their circumstances, they require me to go away to look through some of our archive of resources, some of our data, get a really detailed answer. And that's very difficult to do while I'm also doing the PowerPoint presentation. So if that is the case for you, or you're particularly keen to work with us, you're already convinced, please do follow the kind of guidance that should be playing as a video on the screen now to book a consultation to speak with James or one of your team. I believe that. Do you do the phone still, James? I can't remember.
A little bit, yeah.
So you might be lucky. You'll have to be lucky in the exclusive club of people who get James. Fab. Okay. So this is a good one for you, James. So Vinci asks, what if my subject doesn't have an admissions test? How does that change the pie chart?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I mean, the vast majority, as we know, of subjects do require an admissions test, but there are those without an admissions test. So generally what that means is that there is more emphasis on your interview, because again, that's something that, maybe it's harder to really quantify interview performance in the same way as a test. However, it's still the same thing that everybody's doing in this application. So if you don't have an admissions test, your interview becomes, vastly more important in the decision making alongside everything else that we've discussed. So if you're preparing for an application this year, even if your interview wouldn't be until December, I would really encourage you to start preparing for it now, because it is going to be enormously important.
Thanks, James. This is a good example of something I could look up, but unfortunately I can't. I'm fairly confident that the main subject at Oxford that doesn't have an admissions test is chemistry, and that chemistry interviews more people than any other subject at Oxford as a proportion of applicants. I would have to check, but that is what I remember being the case. And now let's take another question. We have a question from Sophie-Anne. Do you know what do Oxford and Cambridge think about resits? Now, my understanding is they're not very keen on them. Is that your understanding too, James?
It is, yeah. I mean, I know, for things like super scoring and the American applications, they definitely don't like that. I think it's the same for any resits.
Yeah, I think if there are really compelling personal circumstances to the resit, then that may help. But for the most part, it's gonna put you at a disadvantage if you're going and resitting the exam, because again, it's about this question of comparability. If you're taking the exam 2, maybe even more times, that gives you an advantage compared with students who are only sitting it once, and that means that the students who sit it once do get a kind of preferential treatment there. Emma asks about our support for the TSA. What do we do for the TSA, James?
Yeah, so I mean, the TSA is, as with all the tests, to be honest with you, definitely a test that you can prepare well for. I think in terms of preparing for a test, I don't think that you need to start preparing for it the year before your application. But if you're a 2024 applicant, so applying in October this year, then really as early as you can start from now would be recommended, because again, it's the law of diminishing returns, isn't it? You're going to go from maybe 30 to 50% quite quickly, but to get from sort of 70 to 80%, getting yourself in the real sort of top of the cohort, that's going to take a lot longer. And so what most students do is leave this till the summer. They see an increase in their score, they think, oh, I've got this is easy. But then ultimately they'll plateau, and they won't leave themselves enough time to move from where they plateau into the top, of the test. And that happens year in, year out. That's why we're so passionate, or certainly I am anyway, about starting early, because you have to. You just don't know where you're going to plateau. And if you don't give yourself enough time to push through that, and you don't have the right, input to do that, you're making it difficult for yourself. In terms of how we support, please give us a call. We can talk about your particular context, and make a plan of action for you. But generally, it's a combination of those things that I mentioned in the slides earlier: tuition, materials, courses, so on.
Yeah, thanks, James. We have one question about international medicine applicants. So the number of places available to study medicine for non-UK students is very small. This is because the medical education process in the UK is tied up with the National Health Service. And so there is an expectation that if you train as a doctor in the UK, it's to work in a UK government hospital, essentially. And that means that there are, I believe, normally only about 10 places each in Oxford and Cambridge for international medics, if I remembered that right, James?
Yeah, it's about right, yeah.
And so it is a really challenging application process. It's something we've had success with. I think it was either 1 or 2 of our students got in last year, which is something we're incredibly proud of because it's such a big proportion. But in terms of predicted grades of things like that, I wouldn't worry so much about that in the case of medicine, Oxford medicine, and Cambridge medicine for international applicants, because it is you really do have to be in the top, 3 or 4% of people applying. And I can see some more questions have come up on this. So this is a great example for Ad, of when it's helpful to have a proper conversation with you, because I can see already that there are 3 or 4 different sets of personal circumstances that are going on, different things we'd have to balance, things I need to look up. So please do get in touch directly, because that's going to be so much easier to answer your question rather than me trying to remember statistics or things of that nature. Emma asks about A-level predictions versus GCSE scores. Is it worth trying again if you meet your A-level predictions? Is it worth? So this is a question about reapplying as well, which is one of my favorite topics.
I like this topic as well.
So our experience, and this is really backed up by the data, is that reapplying is surprisingly effective. There are only a very small number of subjects for which students who are reapplying are less successful, and for almost everything they are more successful, and in some cases more successful by a really quite considerable margin. Sometimes 40, 50, or even 60% more likely to get an offer if they're applying for the second time round. So if your son does get those fantastic predicted grades, if you're applying with 3 A stars already in your pocket, that does make the application process that little bit easier. You don't have to worry about meeting your offer because you already have. You've got that additional time to focus on the admissions test. You're a year older and hopefully a year cleverer. And so, yeah, that's a really interesting student profile and the kind of thing that we've had success in the past and will be delighted to speak more about. Would you be able to take Oliver's question for me, James?
Yes, let's have a look. Okay, so Oliver's talking about applying for a sort of a dual course like history and politics. So it's the same idea. You're going to have an interview for history, you're going to have an interview for politics, but I believe off the top of my head, you only do a history test. You don't have 2 tests. Some subjects have 2 tests. History and English. You've got to take the HAT and the ELAT. So just take that admissions test slice and sort of cut it in half for the ELAT and the HAT. For history and politics in particular, I believe there's just the HAT. So you're preparing for your admissions test as you would for any other subject, and you're preparing for sort of 2 separate interviews. So I guess there's a little bit more reading that you need to do. You've got to be a little bit more practiced in talking about both history and politics, but it's essentially the same application, and you would prepare in the same way, just knowing that you're going to have a separate interview for each subject.
Brilliant. Thanks, James. We've had an absolutely massive number of questions this week. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and dash through a few of these as quickly as I possibly can so that we can so that we're not leaving too many people hanging. A few of these answers are going to be less helpful than others, though, so I apologize for that. Sophie Ann asks about acceptance rates for the NGAR. This is another one I'll have to look up, so please do give us a call and I will find the answer for you. There's a question about contextualizing GCSE grades. This is another one that's quite complicated because there are a lot of factors that go into it. Oxford do more contextualizing on GCSE grades than Cambridge do, but it is something that we're aware of and can provide a little bit of guidance and help on. But again, it's all about context, and so without getting more context as to who you are, it's very difficult for us to say. There are a couple of questions about personal statements and reading. What I'm going to suggest is we have a personal statement webinar coming up in a few weeks, and there is also in the archive, which you can find at the same link you signed up for this webinar on, a whole series of personal statement webinars from back in the autumn and last summer. I would recommend going and have a look at those. It's the same format, the same slide design. It may even be the same me and James. And so all of your questions will be answered there. And I think they're good. I think they're good episodes. I think you'll find what you're after. And Mita asks about A-level predicted grades. Don't get hung up on getting nothing but 9s. A mix of 9s and 8s, an occasional 7 you can get away with in medicine. A lot of weight goes on to the BMAT or the UCAT in terms of how your application is assessed. And so don't rule yourself out just because of your GCSE scores. Focus on what you can still change moving forward. And don't forget that there are a whole range of medical schools. You are still a doctor. You're still just as much a doctor if you go to Newcastle as if you go to Oxford. So don't think that only Oxford or Cambridge is the way to become a doctor. It's a little broader than other subjects in that respect. And we then have a few questions from Nina and Emma about the kind of support that we offer. Oh, and Sophianne has filled in some extra context about her resits. That does strike me as being a good excuse. I'm not gonna share with the class. So I would, if you're thinking about resitting, then I think that is a really good piece of context to provide, and it may even be worth dropping an email to the university you're planning to apply to beforehand, just to double check with them how they would treat that, because that sounds to me like a very good excuse indeed. James, I will hand back over to you for a little bit of filling in on what support we can provide, and then we'll close it off.
Sure. So somebody's asking about the LNAT. I mean, give us a call. We can go into a lot of detail, but as a really just short answer, the LNAT is a reading comprehension test. So read as much as you can. Read unfamiliar text. Just get used to that. It's your skill of being able to identify kind of themes within writing. So it's a general reading skill. The more reading you do around law, the better understanding you have of law, vocabulary. That's going to be useful for you. The second part of the LNAT is a piece of academic writing, sort of testing your ability to write articulately. Oh my gosh! Please delete that from the webinar. Testing your ability to testing your ability to write and develop an argument. So as much academic writing practice as possible will be good. But yeah, give us a call. We can talk about strategy, in a lot more detail. And yeah, I think that was that. Yeah,
I think we'll call it a day there. Thank you very much, everyone. If we didn't get to your question, I'm really sorry. We had an absolutely massive number of questions today, and we are constrained with time. If we didn't answer your question, please do get in touch. We will do our very best to answer it directly in conversation with you, as that works even better than me trying to remember statistics from a spreadsheet I haven't looked at for a couple of weeks. So I think all that is left for me to say is thank you very much, James, for joining me this week.
It was a pleasure, as always. Yeah, I'm not back for a while now, though. Maybe not until June.
Oh
sad.
Gosh!
Yeah, sad. Yeah.
Wow. Well, that's Well, I will persist on nevertheless. Have a lovely weekend, everyone, and we will see you in 2 weeks' time when we'll be talking in a bit more detail about the UCAS form and helping you out with that. So goodbye, everybody. Have a lovely weekend.
Bye-bye.